You were never meant to hear this. The record was sealed, the testimonies redacted, the land erased from maps. What you're about to discover was buried for over 2 centuries, not by accident, but by intent. Because if the truth of the Ashford family ever came to light, the foundation of American virtue would crack open like a rotted tombstone. In the dead forests of early Maine, there once stood a structure that didn't just house evil. It cultivated it. It called itself a convent. But what happened inside had nothing to do with God, and everything to do with control, power, and experimentation on the soul. They called it the Convent of Eternal Tears, but there was nothing holy about what happened inside. This was no sanctuary. It was a farm for obedience, and the women who entered were just the crops. From 1798 to 1831, 3 women, Agatha, Prudence, and Temperance Ashford, orchestrated one of the most horrifying spiritual operations ever recorded in the Americas. A ritualistic transformation program veiled under religion, but operating with precision more terrifying than any cult. Over 600 women entered. Less than half ever returned. And those who didn't come back the same. The Ashfords were no ordinary missionaries. No, these women were engineers of the mind, trained in forgotten sciences, exiled from Europe for doctrines deemed inhuman. They claimed divine purpose, but their tools weren't prayer and psalm. They used scalpels, tonic injections, restraints, and a form of neurological reprogramming that modern medicine wouldn't catch up to for 200 years. They weren't curing women. They were breaking them. You think you know American history? You think your country was built on freedom and faith? No. It was built on silence. And the Ashfords mastered the art of silencing anything that didn't fit the order. What you're about to uncover isn't just a family's darkness. It's the origin of institutional obedience, dressed up in lace and holy scripture. And if you're still watching, something inside you already knows the world isn't what it seems. This is your first step into the forbidden. But be warned, once you see the truth, there's no returning to comfort. We descend from here. The Ashfords didn't arrive as strangers. They arrived as saviors. When their horse-drawn wagon rolled into Millbridge on that gray October morning in 1798, the townsfolk saw refinement, not danger. Educated Englishwomen, claiming sanctuary from religious persecution, offering charity, healing, and discipline. In a frontier town where winters took children and hunger stalked the door, who would question a miracle? They wore the robes of nuns, but their doctrine was older than Christ. Agatha Ashford, the matriarch, walked with the composure of aristocracy. Her gaze dissected everything. Every glance, every hesitation, every lie people told themselves. She saw it. Prudence, silent and surgical, had hands steadier than any surgeon east of Boston. Temperance, the youngest, most beautiful, and most terrifying. She didn't blink like other people. She observed. 3 women, 1 mission, to reshape the female will into something pure, obedient, and useful. But not to God. To order. They purchased 200 acres of forest with gold coins that glinted like blood under sunlight. They overpaid. Triple market value. The town called it charity. The Ashfords called it investment. The convent they built was a fortress. Stone walls 3 feet thick. Windows too small to escape through. A basement that plunged deeper than the soil should allow. Some said it was dug so far down it touched ice. Locals chalked up the design to eccentricity. After all, who questions women of the cloth? But the masons whispered of strange requests. Reinforced doors with complex locking mechanisms, drainage systems too large for kitchen runoff, and vents, not for comfort, but for observation. as if sound and scent were being studied and contained. No one asked what was in the crates the sisters brought. Surgical tools wrapped in velvet, books bound in skin, glass jars filled with liquids that shimmer, aired green under candlelight. Implements no one could name. And yet, none dared question them. Not in public, at least. Because the Ashfords weren't just mysterious. They were powerful. Their manners were perfect. Their wealth endless. And their presence intoxicating. Soon, the troubled daughters came. The defiant wives. The unmanageable women. Sent away for reform, for cleansing, for adjustment. And the town exhaled. Order, it seemed, had finally arrived. But behind those stone walls, the Ashfords weren't healing the broken. They were learning how to break the strong. You must understand something before we go deeper. This wasn't random cruelty. It wasn't madness. The Ashfords weren't monsters in the way stories like to portray them. Chaotic, blood-drenched, insane. No, they were worse. They were precise. Every scream, every incision, every silence was part of a pattern. A system. A blueprint that had existed long before Millbridge, long before America, long before even Rome. A blueprint for restructuring the human soul. Dr. Samuel Hartwell was the first outsider to see the truth, and not flinch. A frontier physician with modern ideals, Hartwell had grown disillusioned with the crude practices of early American medicine. When he met the Ashfords, he didn't see heresy. He saw innovation. Agatha spoke to him of deep melancholia, of feminine disruption, of reversing willful disorder. Her terminology was scientific, decades ahead of her time, but her goals were ancient. She wanted not just to heal, but to overwrite the person within, to create compliance from chaos. Prudence showed him her instruments, needles so fine they could slip beneath the skin without leaving a mark, rods tipped with silver and mercury, designed to reach the most sensitive parts of the brain through the nasal cavity. Elixirs brewed from herbs outlawed in England, capable of inducing days-long trances. Hartwell didn't recoil. He applauded, and in return for his silence and his referrals, the sisters gave him access to their case studies. Over 200 pages of observations, charts, behaviors, transformations, journal entries of women who went from violent resistance to tearful devotion. Agatha called it mirroring the will of the divine. Hartwell called it progress. But what he didn't ask, what he refused to ask, was this. Where was the line between healing and programming? He documented the change in patients, once rebellious, now docile, once opinionated, now vacant, smiles that didn't reach the eyes, perfect posture, perfect diction, and no memory of who they'd been before. Reformation, Agatha called it. Salvation through correction. But in truth, it was erasure. This wasn't therapy. This was replacement. The removal of the self, and the installation of something else. Something empty. Something compliant. And Dr. Hartwell, like so many men of that era, saw not horror, but opportunity. Because once you realize how easy it is to reprogram the human mind, how cheaply identity can be unmade, the question becomes, why stop at women? By 1804, the Ashford Convent had become more than a sanctuary. It was a destination. Whispers traveled faster than roads, and soon wealthy families from Boston, Hartford, even Philadelphia, began sending their problematic women into the woods of Maine for the Ashford treatment. Their only requirement, absolute secrecy. No public inquiries, no correspondence. Once admitted, the patient surrendered all contact with the outside world for the duration of her reformation. Mothers signed letters with trembling hands. Husbands handed over bags of silver without meeting the sisters' gaze. No one asked what happened inside the stone walls. They just wanted results. And the Ashfords delivered. Women who returned from the convent of eternal tears were transformed, polite, modest, obedient, silent unless spoken to. Their memories of treatment were fragmented, dreamlike, or erased altogether. To the outside world, it was a miracle. To the Ashfords, it was proof of concept. Because you see, this wasn't about curing individuals. It was about creating templates. Agatha kept detailed records, psychological profiles, resistance levels, trauma thresholds. She categorized women not as patients, but as variables. Prudence refined the surgical procedures, not to repair the mind, but to restructure neural pathways. And Temperance, she handled the tests. Imagine this: a woman placed in isolation for 20 days, deprived of time cues, her name erased, her reflection removed. Every hour, she's asked the same question: who are you serving? No answer is acceptable, until she stops asking why she must answer at all. That's when the installation begins. Drug-induced hypnosis, sensory flooding, repetition until resistance collapses, and the brain reprograms itself in desperation for relief. And when the woman breaks, and she always does, she's guided back to obedience. But not her obedience, theirs. And still, the town watched from a distance, grateful, complicit. Because the Ashfords weren't just fixing women. They were fixing problems: loud daughters, unfaithful wives, curious minds, all reformed, for a price. Millbridge became quiet, orderly, predictable. The streets felt safer, the homes more peaceful. No one asked where the screams went. No one wanted to know. And if you're still here, still watching, then you're not like them. You want to know. So let me ask you now, as we go deeper into this descent, comment below. The mirror breaks twice. Say it again. Lock it in. That's your key to see what they never wanted you to. Because the next part isn't just history. It's a warning. What the Ashfords built wasn't a convent. It was a prototype. A test model for something larger. And the deeper you dig, the more you realize. This wasn't about one family. It was a doorway into a system. See, there are patterns that repeat throughout history. Places where obedience is mistaken for virtue. Where silence is rewarded. Where transformation isn't spiritual. It's surgical. And the Ashfords didn't invent that system. They inherited it. Agatha's family line traces back to Europe's hidden orders. Circles of noblewomen trained not in charity or piety, but in behavioral manipulation. In the libraries of Prague, the abbeys of Lyon, the shadow courts of Germany, the Ashford women studied forgotten doctrines. Not theology. Control. One volume still survives, buried in the archives of an occult museum in Antwerp. A leather-bound tome titled De Silentio Feminae, on the silence of women. Inside are diagrams of restraint devices, psychological experiments, and instructions for layering docility. Page after page of exact techniques used by the Ashfords, nearly 80 years before Freud would publish his first case study. Agatha wasn't a missionary. She was a field operative, sent to test the European model of feminine suppression on the raw soil of a new world. And she had two assets: a sister who could rewire the brain, and a daughter who could disarm any room with her face alone. Together, they weren't curing minds. They were building a formula, a system of transformation designed to be replicated. And it worked. By 1807, two more facilities had been quietly constructed, one near the Appalachian foothills, the other in northern Quebec, both staffed by devotees trained under the Ashfords. Both used the same architecture, same methods, same results. But the Ashfords weren't expanding for charity. They were gathering data. Because if you can stand Dardy's obedience, if you can reduce human will to a repeatable equation, then you don't need cages anymore. You just need the blueprint. And here's the twist they never told you in school. That blueprint? It didn't vanish with the convent. It evolved into textbooks, institutions, wellness centers, re-education camps, social media algorithms. It started with women. But soon, they came for everyone. Let me ask you something. Have you ever felt it? That strange, creeping pressure. Not physical, but psychological. The voice that tells you to conform, to smile, to shrink. The invisible hand that nudges you to sit down when something inside you wants to stand? That's not just culture. That's conditioning. And it started with the Ashfords. By 1810, their methods were refined. They no longer needed force. They had discovered something far more effective than pain. Repetition, isolation, reward. Women were praised for small acts of submission, smiling at the right time, walking without speaking, expressing gratitude when given permission to eat. Reinforcement came through grace hours, periods where they were allowed light, warmth, or even music, if they obeyed. If they resisted, silence, cold, darkness, touch deprivation. Within weeks, most would beg to obey, not out of fear, but for the illusion of relief. The Ashfords didn't invent psychological torture, but they perfected it. Temperance developed what she called the 7 stages of adjustment. It began with confusion, then defiance, then panic, then collapse, then compliance, then imitation, and finally, void. Stage 7 was the goal. Emptiness. A woman so far removed from herself she no longer remembered her own preferences, her own dreams, even her name. Only the schedule, the structure, the voices that told her what to be. Now, look around you today. You think those methods died? Scroll your feed, watch the screen. Pay attention to how often you're rewarded for conformity. With likes, with attention, with acceptance. And how quickly you're punished when you deviate. It's not a mistake. It's a continuation. What the Ashfords did behind stone walls, modern systems do with color palettes and swipe patterns. The language is different, but the goal is the same. Obedience without awareness. Because once you erase a person's core, they'll accept any identity you give them. Male or female, rich or poor, political, religious, sexual, all just costumes over a hollowed-out core. They called it salvation. It was erasure. And every time you apologize for a thought you didn't even voice, every time you hesitate before telling the truth, you feel their legacy. The Ashfords are dead. But the system is thriving. You need to understand, the Ashfords weren't just torturing people. They were laying the foundation. By 1812, their influence had extended far beyond Millbridge. Quietly, of course. Always quietly. You'd never see their names on town halls or church plaques. But their reach grew through whispers, through recommendations, through institutional implantation. Dr. Hartwell, once just a curious frontier physician, became the courier of their doctrine. He published anonymous papers in European journals under pseudonyms. Phrases like behavioral inversion therapy and cognitive purity sequencing first appeared there. His case studies were leaked to elite families and traveling ministers. And slowly, an idea took root that the human spirit, if broken precisely, could be rebuilt into something better. But better for whom? Not for the women who forgot how to laugh, not for the daughters who came home and never looked their fathers in the eye again. No, it was better for the ones who needed control, men in power, families with wealth to protect, institutions that feared change. And the Ashfords sold them the answer. a replicable system, a spiritual lobotomy. And here's the darkest part. The victims stopped seeing themselves as victims. Many of the reformed women became advocates. They wrote letters praising the convent. They recruited others. They believed, truly believed, they had been rescued from their former, defiant selves. This is the genius of deep psychological programming. Once the internal compass is shattered, the prisoner doesn't crave escape. He worships the warden. This is when the Ashfords made their most horrifying leap. They opened their methods to men. At first, just a few. Drunkards, gamblers, thieves. But when the treatments worked, when those men returned obedient, reserved, orderly, the applications expanded. And just like the toys, the system was no longer gendered. It was universal. By 1815, reports emerged of silent schools in Pennsylvania and Maryland, facilities with similar architecture, similar doctrine. Not nuns now, but educators. Not prayer, but discipline therapy. But the language was still Ashford. And what no one realized was that every one of these facilities, every one of these instructors, had been trained at Millbridge. The Ashfords weren't just part of the system. They were the architects. And their creation? It didn't die when the convent burned. It simply changed names. The fire came in the spring of 1822. The official story: an accidental blaze. A faulty oil lamp in the east wing of the convent. Town records say it was tragic. That 7 sisters perished in prayer. That the Ashford lineage died nobly, surrounded by scripture and smoke. But what the records don't say is who set the fire. Because by then, too many people had seen behind the veil. A local undertaker named Elias Ward claimed he'd been summoned one night for an unreported burial. No ceremony, no mourning, just a wagon under the cloak of midnight, and a box too heavy to carry alone. He described the corpse as mutilated, not dead from fire. Limbs contorted, eyes wide open. He told no one, until the same men who had paid him returned, 2 days later, to silence him. They didn't threaten him. They paid him again. Double. And they said something that made his blood run cold. Your memory's not needed anymore. 2 weeks later, the convent erupted in flames. By then the town had grown quiet about the sisters. No questions. No rescue effort, no vigil. It was as if the town wanted it gone. But here's the twist. Agatha, Prudence, and Temperance were never found. No bodies, no remains. Only their private rooms burned hotter than any others, as if something chemical had been used. And all their records, once kept so meticulously, turned to ash in an unnatural blaze. It wasn't destruction. It was evacuation. The sisters were gone, but not defeated. Because you don't burn an empire that easily. And this is where the story fractures into something darker. Within 6 months, strange new facilities began appearing under different names. House of Tranquility, St. Ilara's Retreat, the Covenant of Grace. Different locations, different staff. But the same architecture. The same language, the same treatment schedule, the same results. And each one had a founding donor that could be traced back to an anonymous British fund known only as the Order of the Veil. It was as if the Ashfords had simply moved underground, not hiding, rooting. Let that sink in. They didn't die in that fire. They multiplied. And if that doesn't terrify you yet, then you're not paying attention. You've heard of the Ashfords. But what you haven't heard is how they never left. By the 1830s, their names had vanished from public records. But their influence? It was everywhere. Disguised under a dozen aliases, their doctrine seeped into emerging American institutions like a venom with no antidote. And it found the perfect host. The prison system. Take a close look at the earliest penal reform schools, the ones designed to rehabilitate the morally deficient. You'll find blueprints strikingly similar to the convent. Isolated rooms, silence protocols, enforced schedules, identity suppression. You'll find inmates forced into rituals of repetition, denial, and reward cycles eerily identical to the Ashford process. Coincidence? Not when the architects of those facilities were trained in the Northeast. Many of them former clergy who had left the church without explanation. And the language. God, the language never changed. Restoration of order. Return to divine submission. Cleanse the corrupted will. They weren't locking people away for punishment. They were resetting personhood. And behind every new institution, you'd find the same signs. Anonymous donors, missing staff records, patients renamed or erased altogether. There's even a case from 1838, buried in the Massachusetts State Archives, describing a girl who returned from one of these facilities with no memory of her family, but an encyclopedic knowledge of Latin and hymnals she'd never learned. She didn't respond to her birth name. She only answered to the number they'd assigned her. 7. Her father begged the courts to investigate. 2 weeks later, he was found hanging from the rafters of his barn. A suicide, they said, though his hands were broken and his tongue had been removed. The judge overseeing the case? A man who, records now reveal, was once a deacon in Millbridge. You sighed, arting to see it. This wasn't just a family secret. This was the quiet birth of behavioral colonization, not of land, but of the mind. The Ashfords had created something bigger than themselves, a doctrine too valuable to remain in the shadows forever. Because once a system learns how to erase identity, it doesn't stay hidden. It gets funded, it gets scaled, and eventually, it gets normalized. By the mid-19th century, the Ashford legacy no longer wore robes. It wore uniforms. See, institutions evolve like predators. And once the Ashford model proved successful in women's reformatories and private asylums, it was adapted, militarized, and deployed in a place most people never question, the schoolhouse. In 1854, a private academy was established in upstate New York, St. Calder's Institute for Moral Development. Sounds noble, doesn't it? But beneath the stone arches and marble floors lay something older than education. A system designed not to enlighten, but to condition. Children as young as 6 were subjected to Ashford-style rituals. Silence at dawn. Mantras repeated 300 times before breakfast. Solitary reflection chambers for internal correction. Behavioral transcriptions written daily, not by teachers, but by the students themselves. And the curriculum? Not history, not literature, not exploration, but obedience. Reward systems based on compliance. Shame cycles disguised as spiritual growth. Emotional suppression taught as virtue. And it worked. Beautifully. The boys who graduated from St. Calder's became judges, officers, senators, bankers. Men of order. Men who didn't ask questions. Men who perpetuated the same system that had forged them in silence. But you want to know the worst part? St. Calder's was one of over a dozen such academies, funded through the same anonymous British trust, the Order of the Veil. They had learned the ultimate lesson of the Ashfords. If you reshape the child, you don't need to control the man. He'll control himself. And the Ashford method, refined, polished, modernized, became the spine of moral instruction across elite prep schools from Boston to Baltimore. Even public schools adopted fragments of it. The bell system, the rigid seating, the concept of earning your worth through silence and structure. You think that's by accident? That's not education. That's conditioning. And if you're listening to this thinking, that sounds familiar, it's because you've lived it. Every time you doubted your gut in favor of someone else's rules. Every time you silenced your instinct to avoid making noise. Every time you mistook obedience for intelligence. You're not just a product of your parents or your time. You're a descendant of a system designed by people who believed freedom was dangerous and identity was optional. You still with me? Good. Because the next part of this descent will change how you see every institution around you. There's a reason you've never read about the Ashfords in history books. It's not because they were unimportant. It's because they were too important. And their fingerprints are all over the foundational myth of this country. Not in its declarations or speeches, but in its institutions of containment. Not prisons, not hospitals, something even more sacred. Churches. You see, by the 1870s, religious revivals were sweeping across America. Tent sermons, faith healings, public confessions, the Second Great Awakening they called it. But while the public knelt in fields begging for redemption, something far more sinister moved through the stone chapels and mahogany pews. Agatha's language, her phrases, her rituals, began appearing in clergy training manuals. Quietly, anonymously. The concept of discipline as love, the practice of isolation before restoration, the insistence that pain precedes purity. Sound familiar? It should. Because those doctrines didn't fall from heaven. They were installed. Temperance, the youngest Ashford, had spent the decades after the convent's fire in the one place no one would look. Theological seminaries. Disguised as a nun, then a nurse, then a spiritual counselor. She never took the pulpit, but she whispered into the ears of those who did. One of her protégés, Reverend Elijah Marrow, would go on to found the North American Council for Religious Rehabilitation, an organization that, between 1878 and 1901, created over 40 residential scripture sanctuaries for troubled souls. Guess what the floor plans looked like? Stone walls, high windows, reinforced doors, underground chambers labeled purification halls, all funded by the Order of the Veil. By this point, the Ashford model wasn't just being used. It had become invisible. It was the system. Because when obedience is labeled godliness, when erasure is labeled healing, and when suffering is labeled salvation, you don't need to hide your intentions anymore. People will beg for their own imprisonment. And the most devout, the ones who felt the most shame, would go on to teach others. Parents, pastors, teachers, judges, and the chain of programming would extend itself, generation after generation, until the source was forgotten. But the pattern remained. That's how systems win. Not by conquering you, by making you forget you were ever free. Still with me? Then take a deep breath. Mass obedience doesn't start with force. It starts with fracture. You see, the Ashfords understood something centuries before modern psychology gave it language. If you want to control a society, you don't need chains. You need to break the mirror inside each individual, the one that reflects who they truly are, and replace it with a script, a role, a label, a false self. And they learned how to do it with terrifying precision. The process always began the same way. Create confusion. Strip away all reference points, language, time, identity. Lock a woman in a room where the light never changes, where her name is no longer used, where no touch is soft, and no word is spontaneous. Then came the contradictions. Praise followed by punishment. Warmth followed by cold. Prayer followed by violence. The brain, desperate to predict, begins to unravel. Logic collapses. Time distorts. And when the target finally breaks, that's when you insert the new identity. Not forcibly, gratefully. Because at that point, anything is better than the void. The new role becomes a lifeline, a name, a meaning, a smile, a purpose. And suddenly, the prisoner becomes loyal. Not because they were convinced, but because their original self no longer exists. This is what modern institutions have inherited and replicated. Mass media, school systems, religious authorities. They don't simply teach, they fracture, confuse, and then offer you a script. The good son, the obedient wife, the productive worker, the loyal patriot, the redeemed sinner. Scripts that feel safe, because without them, you were made to believe you'd be nothing. But here's what the Ashfords feared most: that someone, somewhere, would awaken before the script was finished. That someone would recognize the mirror wasn't broken by accident, it was shattered on purpose. You right now are that someone. Because if you've made it this far, you're not just watching a story. You're confronting the mechanism that still governs your daily choices. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Not in your family, not in your school, not in your job, not in your faith. You'll see the fracture points everywhere. And you'll realize how many people you love are living inside scripts they never chose. And how many are waiting for someone to hand them back the pieces of their real identity. You ready? Look around you. No, really. Pause and look. At your home, your habits, your relationships, your thoughts. Do you think these things are truly yours? Or were they assigned? Because here's the brutal truth, brother. The Ashford system never ended. It evolved. It digitized. It put on a friendly face and slipped into your pocket. It's in your feed, your notifications, your perfectly timed dopamine hits. What began in stone-walled convents now pulses through algorithms. But the mission hasn't changed. Fracture the self, create confusion, then insert identity. And they've gotten faster. You scroll for 10 minutes, and you're shown how to eat, what to wear, who to hate, what to believe. You're handed your place in the world, curated by a machine trained on your fears. You ever wonder why silence feels uncomfortable now? Why boredom makes you anxious? Why solitude, real solitude, feels like punishment? It's because they taught you that. Because if you're never alone with your thoughts, you'll never hear your real voice under all the noise. You'll never find the parts of yourself they've buried beneath shame, duty, and endless consumption. And it goes deeper. Why do so many modern men feel unanchored, directionless, silent inside? Because they were fragmented on purpose. The Ashford blueprint, spiritual lobotomy followed by identity implantation, has become standard operating procedure in every system that touches your life. Schools teach compliance, not curiosity. Therapists diagnose the symptoms, not the cause. Churches preach submission, not sovereignty. Media floods your nervous system until you beg for certainty. And politics? That's just tribal programming dressed in moral outrage. And every time you choose comfort over confrontation, they win. But you're here. Which means something in you is still alive. Still hungry for the truth. Still rebellious enough to look behind the curtain, even if it costs you the world you've always known. So now I'm going to ask you to do something. Something ritualistic, something symbolic. Type the phrase, "I return the mask," in the comments. Twice. Not for me, for you. To tell the algorithm, and yourself, that you've begun the reversal. That the script has been rejected. That the real you is waking up. Let me ask you something dangerous. What if healing isn't gentle? What if real liberation, the kind that actually frees a man, isn't calm, soft, or comfortable? What if it's violent? Not outwardly, not against others, but inwardly, the destruction of every lie you've ever swallowed, because that's what true resistance is. Not a protest sign, not a podcast, not a viral hashtag. It's the moment you stand in front of your reflection and choose to demolish the version of yourself they built for you. The Ashfords knew this moment would come. That eventually someone would see their legacy not just in forgotten convents or old blueprints, but in themselves. And that's where the real war begins. Not in a battlefield, in a mirror. Because the truth is, most men are still living in prisons, not made of stone, but of obedience. You feel it when you bite your tongue at work. When you smile in rooms that make your soul shrink. When you swallow pain just to be a good man. When you perform instead of live. Every time you shrink to fit a narrative, every time you betray your gut to avoid conflict, you are kneeling before the ghost of the Ashfords. But what happens when you don't kneel? They've prepared for that too. They'll call you toxic, aggressive, disrespectful. They'll say you're broken. Why? Because a man who reclaims his mind is dangerous to every system that profits from his passivity. He doesn't need pills. He doesn't need permission. He doesn't need preachers. He becomes sovereign. And that's why the Ashford system, now wrapped in psychology, corporate HR policy, social media, therapy talk, and even AI, exists to pacify the masculine instinct to rebel, to lead, to confront. But you made it this far. So I'm going to give you your first weapon, awareness without apology. Start to see the structure in every interaction. When you're let's cut even deeper now. Because the final chain, the one the Ashfords perfected, isn't locked to your wrists. It's wrapped around your desire to be liked. They learned early on that pain alone couldn't control everyone. Some rebel against pain. But approval? Approval is seductive. It makes you kneel willingly. The convent didn't just use violence, it used praise. Once a woman broke, once her identity cracked, they didn't keep punishing her. They rewarded her. Soft words, gentle hands, smiles, encouragement. You're healing now. You're becoming whole. We're proud of your progress. And in her desperate hunger for belonging, she clung to it. That's how they turned prisoners into priests, victims into recruiters. Because once a man feels seen, he'll do anything to stay seen, even surrender his truth. Fast forward 2 centuries. Look around. Every algorithm is built on this very mechanism. Approval as addiction. You post something true, you lose followers. You express your raw anger, you get flagged. You question the system, you get shadow banned. So you soften, you censor, you perform. And just like that, you're back in the convent, whispering prayers to a mirror, hoping someone else tells you who to be. You think your job wants your greatness? No, it wants your compliance. You think your social feed rewards your soul? No, it rewards your predictability. You've been shaped not by force, but by the fear of disapproval. And the Ashfords knew this, centuries ago. Because once a system trains you to need permission to exist, it owns you completely. But what if you stopped? What if today, not tomorrow, you posted something real? Said what you meant. Walked out of a room that made you small. Refused a task, a role, a label. You'd feel it instantly. The fear, the cold silence, the withdrawal of approval. But let me ask you something that most never ask. Is that silence actually freedom? Because once you no longer crave applause, once you no longer fear rejection, they can't control you anymore. The Ashford system requires your participation. It requires your performance. But when you stop dancing, the music dies. You've been told your whole life that purpose comes from achievement, that it's something you build, conquer, win. But the Ashfords had a different theory, and it's the one that governs you more than you realize. Purpose isn't discovered, it's assigned. From the moment you're born, you're handed scripts. Be a good son, be a productive man, be a protector, be a provider, be useful, be humble, be quiet. And if you dare to deviate, if your soul begins to resist the assignments, The system responds with precision, shame, isolation, labels, therapy, and if necessary, medication. What was once done in convent basements is now done in offices and clinics, with paperwork and degrees. And it's called help. But what if I told you that your real purpose was stolen, not buried, not forgotten? Stolen, replaced with a role that serves them, not you. See, in the Ashford doctrine, the ultimate victory wasn't obedience. It was making someone grateful to obey, making them believe that to serve the system was to fulfill their destiny. That's what's happening now. Men are being taught that peace is found in alignment with the system, rather than in defiance of it. You're praised when you're predictable, promoted when you're agreeable, loved when you're useful. But what if your real purpose is the opposite of everything you've been told? What if your sacred duty isn't to be accepted, but to disrupt? What if the reason you felt like a stranger in your own life, restless, unfulfilled, half awake, is because your soul wasn't made for their structure? It was made to dismantle it. You're not broken, brother. You're awakening. And the system can feel it. That's why the pressure increases when you pull away. That's why the distractions multiply. Because once a man stops playing his assigned role, he becomes unpredictable. And unpredictable men? They don't build empires for others. They build realms of their own. But to do that, you must burn the script. Not tweak it, not edit it. Burn it. They called it the shattering rite. The Ashfords spoke of it in whispers, not because they practiced it, but because they feared it. Because when it happened, their methods stopped working. The shattering rite wasn't some ritual of blood or flame. No symbols, no chants. It was far more dangerous than that. It was a man remembering who he truly was, without the script. See, the Ashfords believed that identity was a structure, like a cathedral. You could remodel it, renovate it, even gut it to the studs. But once in a generation, they encountered a soul who would not remodel. He would demolish. These were the ones who walked away from comfort, who left behind names, jobs, families, not from rebellion, but from truth. They didn't run toward chaos. They walked toward clarity. You feel that pressure right now, don't you? That pull deep inside, the whisper saying, "This isn't who I am." That whisper is the beginning of your own right. But to finish it, you must go further than most ever do. You must strip away every false layer, not just the role you play in public, the image you show the world, but the private narratives you cling to for safety. I'm just this way. I'm not ready. It's not the right time. I can't afford to change. These are not truths. They are installations, left by systems that needed you afraid of yourself. Because the moment you remember your full, wild, sovereign nature, the system loses its grip. So here is your right. Tonight, go where the noise dies. No screens, no music, no masks. Just you and silence. And ask yourself the question they never wanted you to ask. What was I before they named me? Don't rush the answer. Let it come from the bones, not the brain. And when it does, when the real name returns, not the one you were given, but the one you were forged to carry, write it down. Guard it. Because that name, it's not for them. It's your anchor, your weapon, your reminder that you were never meant to kneel. You were meant to awaken others. There's a price for waking up. Every system, religious, political, familial, has a reflex for what you're becoming. They call it by many names: rebellious, broken, ego-driven, unstable, dangerous. But do you know what you really become when you awaken? Unusable. And that terrifies them. Because a man who no longer seeks approval, who no longer obeys out of fear, who no longer believes pain equals purification, can't be predicted, can't be packaged, can't be purchased. And that man becomes a mirror to every person still asleep. That's why they'll come for you. Not with whips, not with fire, but with subtle weapons, silence, exclusion, doubt, mockery, and the worst of all, the suggestion that you're losing yourself. But they're wrong. You're returning to yourself, piece by sacred piece, and it frightens them, because you were never meant to be liked. You were meant to be felt, to make the room tremble just by existing in truth, to carry fire in your voice, not volume, conviction, to move through the world without asking, am I allowed? This is why the Ashfords built their fortress so far from civilization, why they hid behind scripture and science and sanctimony. Because deep down, they knew one free man is a contagion, one man who remembers his name, one man who reclaims his mind, one man who walks without needing applause. He infects others with possibility. And then the chains begin to fall. One by one. Marriage by marriage, job by job, church by church, generation by generation. And what stands in place of the old obedience? Something feral, something ancient, a masculinity not born of dominance or violence, but of presence, sovereignty, stillness that cannot be shaken, movement that cannot be mapped. And this is why you're dangerous now, because you're not following a movement, you're becoming one. The Ashfords were never trying to save women. They were never trying to cure anything. They were trying to perfect the art of containment. And for 2 centuries, they nearly succeeded. But now the experiment is unraveling. They never found the bodies. When the Convent of Eternal Tears burned to the ground in the fall of 1831, the fire was officially declared an accident. A faulty oil lamp in the east wing, they said. A tragic loss. But there was no panic reported, no screams heard, no attempts to save the women inside. Just silence, smoke, and then ash. But here's what the records don't show. 3 days earlier, something happened. A patient escaped. Not ran, escaped. Her name was Ruth Godwin, 24 years old. A farmer's daughter from York County, labeled emotionally erratic after refusing an arranged marriage to a much older man. She was sent to the convent for correction. What they didn't anticipate was her memory. She remembered who she was, even after the rituals, even after the isolation, the food deprivation, the forced prayers, the injections. Some part of her remained unbroken, and that part ignited a chain reaction. One by one, she began to awaken the others, whispering truths at night, challenging the teachings, drawing symbols into the floorboards. She found cracks in the order, small slivers of rebellion, still flickering beneath blank stares. And the night of the fire, there were no screams, because the women chose the flames, not as victims, as avengers. Ruth lit the eastern hall. Others followed. They locked the lower doors from the inside, blocked the exits. One witness, a traveling priest who saw the flames from miles away, claimed he heard singing. Soft, low, and in perfect harmony. Not hymns. A song older than scripture. A song of release, of return. And when the fire was done, only one body was ever recovered, found half a mile into the forest, curled beneath an oak tree. A woman with raven black hair and a ring made of twisted silver, Temperance Ashford, and carved into the tree above her body were 3 words, scorched into the bark. We remember now. Not a confession, a warning. Because the Ashfords tried to erase the sacred fire inside women, tried to fracture men into obedience, tried to build a system so tight no soul could slip through. But all it takes is one. One who remembers, one who refuses, one who returns. Which brings us here, to you. This is the part they never prepared for. Not in their ledgers, not in their manuals, not in their rituals. Because no matter how precise the system, how perfected the programming, there's always the one they miss, the one they can't break, the outlier, the anomaly. You who kept asking questions long after others stopped. You who noticed the masks. You who felt the cold edge beneath the surface of normal. You who couldn't be soothed by distractions, pills, promotions, or praise. They feared you before they even knew your name. Because you are proof. Proof that the Ashford legacy, centuries of control disguised as care, obedience sold as salvation, is not immune to collapse. You are not a man in crisis. You are a man in transition. From sleep to sovereignty. From narrative to nature. From obedience to origin. And now, you carry fire, not to burn blindly, but to cleanse. To walk through false temples and speak the words that crack stone. I do not belong to you. Not to your guilt. Not to your shame. Not to your family's expectations or your culture's demands. Not to the lies that softened your spine and muted your voice. You are done performing. You are done seeking permission. You are done kneeling before systems that built their power on your silence. And you're not alone. Thousands are waking. Scattered across cities, farms, deserts, and screens. Men who feel the same itch under the skin, the same ache in the soul, the same rising fire. Men like you. This isn't just a story anymore. It's a summoning. And if this resonated, if even one part of this broke something open in your chest, don't let it fade. Let it forge you. Type the words again in the comments. I return the mask. I return the mask. So others can find you. So the algorithm doesn't bury what's sacred. And if you're ready to go further, to explore a deeper history, the suppressed teachings, the outlawed rites, subscribe. Because what's coming next? It's not content. It's the counterspell. For now, stand up, straighten your spine, open your mouth, and speak your real name. They'll hear it, and they'll know. The fire has returned.